Crime has, for example, been increasing for the first time in Minnesota's history. You say on the Powerline blog, for the first time, crime has become a real issue in Minnesota. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Tim Walz has a horrible record. In that sense, it makes him a good running mate for Kamala Harris, who also has a terrible record. Minnesota was always a low crime state. We always had crime rates well below the national average until Tim Walz came along. And as you can see in the chart there, that comes from my organization, American Experiment. Minnesota, starting in 2020 with the George Floyd riots, when Tim Walz dithered for 4 nights, allowed the riots to go on, refused to call in the National Guard because he said he was really pretty sympathetic to the rioters' cause. And a big chunk of the city of Minneapolis burned down, as did other cities in the metropolitan area. Finally, after 4 days, he was persuaded to call out the National Guard, and it stopped the riots, but it didn't stop the crime spree. And crime in Minnesota has continued to be elevated, so that for the first time ever in our history, we are now a high crime state with a higher than average rate of serious crime. That had never happened before the Tim Walz administration.
Yeah, and here's a little bit of J.D. Vance speaking about Tim Walz and his management of those protests.
I think it's interesting, actually. They make an interesting tag team because, of course, Tim Walz allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis in the summer of 2020, and then the few who got caught, Kamala Harris helped bail them out of jail.
I mean, this is a really good point because I feel like there's a big effort to memory hole what happened in 2020, not just with COVID, but with these riots and the way Kamala Harris and the entire left said, hey, these people are okay. They've got a legitimate grievance, while they were burning out communities, while people like Tim Walz said, look, we're not going to go in too hard on them because we sort of agree with them and we think they're right. This seems like a very dangerous combination.
Well, it absolutely is, James. And what J.D. Vance said there was exactly correct. There was something set up called the Minnesota Freedom Fund, and Kamala Harris on Twitter vigorously encouraged everybody donate money to the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Well, the Minnesota Freedom Fund not only bailed out rioters and arsonists, it also bailed out murderers and rapists. Now, there was at least one murder committed by a guy who was bailed out by Kamala Harris's Minnesota Freedom Fund. So this is a real scandal, which, of course, is why the press doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm starting to call Tim Walz the Minnesota Marxist here because it looks like everything he touches is classic big government failure. One other thing that you highlight in your analysis is the way student achievement plummeted while school spending soared. Explain that.
Yeah, this chart says it all, James. The green line on the top there, that is per capita spending on K through 12 public schools, per capita and inflation adjusted. And you can see how in recent years, especially during the Walz administration, spending on the schools has skyrocketed. It's unbelievable. Well, at the same time, student achievement, those lines that are going down, that's math and reading. Student achievement has gone down, down, down. And at this point, James, here again, this is a scandal. More than half of all the public school students in the state of Minnesota can neither read nor do math at grade level. More than half.
Wow.
I mean, we've never seen numbers like this in the history of our state. Tim Walz has been an unbelievable failure in the field of education.
But it's not just education, it's the overall economy, too, because you also point out that overall GDP per capita in the state, which used to be quite prosperous, also fell below the national average, again, for the first time ever, under Tim Walz.
This is amazing, James. Minnesota has always been regarded as a pretty prosperous state. Our gross domestic product per capita, which is really the basic measure of economic well-being, has always been above the national average, always, until 2023, when for the first time ever, as a result of the high taxes, crazy spending, massive regulation, anti-growth, anti-business policies of the Tim Walz administration, Minnesota, for the first time, has a per capita GDP that is below the national average. Tim Walz has taken an above average state economically and made it a below average state.
So as somebody, John, who lives in Minnesota and has lived there for years, decades, what is your warning to Americans and people watching about what Walz might mean as a vice president?
Well, I don't want this man anywhere near the seat of power in Washington, D.C. You know, he's a superficially plausible kind of guy, and I'm concerned that for 90 days, he may be able to get away with this shtick. You know, he's kind of a salesman guy, and he might be able to get away with it for a while. But if you look at his record, and that's what's really important. Same thing with Kamala Harris. Look at her record. If you look at Tim Walz's record, it is one of destruction. Everything he touches has been destroyed. And it's really important that voters understand what he illustrates is the consistent failure of left-wing policies, just like the Biden-Harris administration does.
John Honderegger, we're going to have to leave it there. John Honderegger, president for the Center for the American Experiment. Thank you so much for your time and breaking it down for us. Now,